The word armament can be defined as equipping military forces for war. That's our mission here at Armament, to help prepare our listeners for the spiritual war they face each and every day. So welcome. We're glad you're with us. This is Armament, your Bible boot camp. I'll put this on because my throat's a little scratchy this morning, and I'm a little nervous because I met a celebrity this morning. I post these videos, and by the way, I had owed y'all like 3 videos. John's last 3 videos on resurrection. But I put those up. If you missed any of them, I put them up like late a few nights ago. And I don't think you can adjust the volume on this. I put them up late a few nights ago, and like immediately they had 1 view. And I was like, who is this one viewer that we have all the time? And my neighbors, Stacy and Richard, have been visiting our class, and I found out this morning she's our one fan. So thank you. But anyway, we're going to talk about Numbers this morning. We're going to move on from Leviticus. As much as I hate to say that, we're going to move on from Leviticus and we're going to move into Numbers. It's if you've been keeping track, this month is the 1-year anniversary of our walk through the Torah, which is kind of cool. On one hand, I'm like, man, I can't believe it's taken this long, and on the other hand, we still have 2 books to go. So I'm trying to speed things up for y'all, but we've been going through the Torah for a year now, and I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it. I do have to tell y'all this. This is hilarious to me. Actually, hilarious is probably not the right word. I don't know what the word would be, but I was telling somebody, actually a family member, I was telling them, they know that we've been going through the Torah, and I was bragging on y'all, honestly, is what I was doing. I was like, we're in Leviticus, and they are loving it. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the vibe that I got. And I was telling them, I said, I've got people texting me like, Brad, I'm reading Leviticus on my own, and this is cool. And by the way, that's the only reason anybody does something like this, is so that you go home and look at it. Like the whole point of what John Walker does is to try and create some excitement in all of you, that you would want to go home and look at this stuff yourself. Try and verify if what we're telling you is accurate or not. But so people are texting me like, Brad, I'm in Leviticus. This is so cool. I had somebody text me like, Brad, I'm in the Psalms, and look at this. Like, this is from Leviticus, right? And somebody was like, I'm in the New Testament, and here's Leviticus. I'm in Hebrews, and it's all making sense. And so I'm bragging on y'all. I'm telling this person about it. And what you need to know about this person is they're a little bit of a Debbie Downer. By the way, my mother-in-law's name is Debbie. I am not talking about my mother-in-law, Debbie. If she ever hears these recordings, I am not talking about you, Debbie, as a different Debbie. I'll see you this afternoon. It's a different, I promise, it's a different person, but this person is a little bit of a Debbie Downer. And I'm telling them all this cool stuff about Leviticus, and they go, yeah, well, wait till you get to Numbers. And the first thought in my head was, man, why you got to be like that? Like, why do you always have to be like that, right? But then it started getting in my head. And then I was like, oh man, what's going to happen when we get to Numbers? What if everybody hates it? And so I started kind of freaking out a little bit. And I started thinking, trying to figure out, right, like a mad scientist, I'm trying to figure out, why do people hate Numbers? I'm Googling, why do people hate the book of Numbers? And before, I didn't put the book, and I just said, why do people hate Numbers? And it's a lot of math. People have issues with math. But I'm like, why do people hate the book of Numbers? And a lot less theories on that. And but I think I have a working theory, and I think this is right. I think, to a degree at least, I know why Numbers bothers people, why Numbers can be kind of difficult to understand for a lot of folks. Something happens in Numbers that really carries on throughout the rest of the entire Bible. What it is for the first time in our reading, the text has an expectation of you. The Bible starts to make assumptions about you, the reader. And the assumption is the book of Numbers assumes that you know what has already happened up to that point. The book assumes that you've read the book of Genesis and that you love the book of Genesis and that you understand the book of Genesis and that you've committed all the key parts to memory. That's what the book of Numbers assumes. Not only that, it assumes that you've read the book of Exodus and that you love Exodus and that you understand Exodus and that you've committed all the key parts to memory. And it also assumes that you've understood Leviticus and that you've committed all those key parts to memory. I'll give you an example. We talked about this when we talked about Leviticus. The very first chapter and verse in Numbers 1:1, says in the first day of the second month in the second year of the wilderness, God spoke to Moses in the tent. And you go, well, okay, he's in the tent. Big deal. But if you hadn't already read Exodus, if you weren't aware of what happened in Exodus 25 through 31, where we got all the plans for the tabernacle, and then in Exodus 35 through 40, where we actually build the tabernacle, that we got the plans for it. But then in Exodus 40, verse 34, it says, and the cloud of Yahweh descended onto the tabernacle, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. But then verse 35 says, and Moses could not enter the tabernacle because the glory of Yahweh was in the tabernacle. And you go, bum, bum, bum. Like, what was all of this about? Why did we get these plans for this thing? Why did we build this thing? If you remember, Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the plans. He's in the real heaven, seeing the tabernacle of heaven. And God says, I want you to build one of those down there. And then we do it, and he can't go in. And you're like, what gives? Why did we even make this thing if we can't go in it? And then Numbers 1:1, we find out we got in. In Leviticus 1:1, it says Yahweh spoke to Moses outside the tent. And you're like, well, that makes sense because we can't go in the stinking thing, right? But then Numbers 1:1 says God spoke to Moses in the tent. And you're like, hot dog, we got in. What happened? The book of Leviticus. And if you don't understand the book of Leviticus and everything that happened in that book, then Numbers won't make sense. I'll give you another example. Numbers 11. By the way, when I'm at my peak, like mad scientist, like trying to figure out why people hate numbers, I called John Walker and I was like, I got a bone to pick with you. And he said, let's pick it. And I said, you've taught already on all the cool parts of numbers. I said, I was going to talk about the 12 spies coming back and the Nephilim. I was going to get Trey going with the Nephilim. That's his love language. And you stole that from me, John Walker. And then I said, so I'm not going to do it again. And I said, and then I was going to talk about the bronze serpent and the typology of Christ and the raising of the serpent and the healing of the people. And you stole that from me. And he goes, well, sorry, not sorry. So, but in Numbers 11, something happens. The people, you're not going to believe this, but the Israelites start complaining. And they're complaining because they don't have any meat. It's hilarious because they're like, remember back in Egypt, it was like a golden corral of meat. You know, like we could have whatever we wanted. The fish was delicious until you turned the river into blood and you ruined it for us. And by the way, my favorite griping of all of the Israelite gripings about Egypt is when they say, was it because there were no graves for you to bury us in Egypt? That you brought us out here to die? So anyway, they're complaining they don't have any meat, and God says, listen, you've cried in my ears. Your complaining has fallen in my ears. I'm going to give you so much meat, it's going to come out of your nostrils. He literally says that in chapter 11, and he does it. They eat so much quail, and it says while the meat was still in their teeth, like while they were still chewing, he killed many of them for their griping and their unbelief. Well, then the very next chapter, chapter 12, we get this little story about Miriam, who is Moses' sister, and then Aaron, who's his brother, and they rise up against Moses. They're mad at Moses for marrying a Cushite woman, and they say, what do we need Moses for anyway? Aaron says, God talks directly to us anyway. If you've been keeping track, by the way, God spoke to Aaron one time, right? Aaron's acting like he's best buds with God, and in reality, God spoke to him one time, and he's like, we don't even need Moses. What's his deal? So God hears it. He gives Miriam leprosy for her complaining, and Moses does what any good brother does, and he prays for her healing, and God says, yeah, I'll heal her, but she's going to be unclean for 7 days. Something else happens in chapter 12 that's hilarious to me. Moses, it says, I forget what verse, but it says, Moses was the most humblest man in the entire world. There was not a man in the world more humble than Moses. Remember, Moses wrote the Torah. That sounds like Donald Trump to me. You wouldn't believe how humble I am. I'm the most humble guy that's ever been. And don't get me wrong, I'm not playing a political card here. I'm just saying it just sounds like him a little bit. But anyway, so Miriam gets punished for her sin. Then the very next chapter, it's chapter 13, we get the 12 spies. They go out, they come back. Only Joshua and Caleb have the good report. The other 10 start spreading the lies and the rumors and everything. And by chapter 14, God's ready to wipe them out, right? And he says to Moses, he says, I'm going to wipe them out, and I'm going to start all over and build a greater nation with just you. And Moses says, God, don't do that. That's not in your character. Let's not do that. And God says, you know what? You're right. It's not in my character, but I tell you this. The men who saw my signs and wonders in Egypt will not see the land I swore to their fathers. And he says, for they have tested me these 10 times in the wilderness. And you go, 10 times? I know about the meat. I know about Miriam. And I know about the 12 spies, but what 10 times are you talking about? And he's talking about the 3 tests from the book of Numbers in chapter 11, 12, and 13. And he's also talking about the 7 tests that we studied all the way back in Exodus. I don't know if y'all remember that. But from chapter 14 and the splitting of the Red Sea to chapter 24, there were 7 tests. The people tested God 7 times. And that's what he's talking about. When he says, you've tested me these 10 times, there's 3 in Numbers, there's 7 in Exodus. And see, this stuff doesn't really make sense if you haven't understood and committed to memory the key parts from what's already happened. You see what I'm saying? And again, this is true throughout the rest of the Bible. You get to the Gospel of Matthew, and it doesn't make sense if you haven't already read the Old Testament and understood the Old Testament, and you love the Old Testament, and you've committed many key parts to memory. And it's certainly true about Revelation. That's how you end up with all these whack job theories about what the book of Revelation even means, because people don't understand the first 65 books of the Bible, right? They start telling you it's all allegorical, it's a big metaphor, there really isn't a millennial reign, and you start playing God. You're picking and choosing which parts of the Bible are true, right? So it's a very dangerous game. And that's why when John was like, when he asked me a year ago if there would be any interest even in possibly teaching, he travels all the time for his job, and he's like, I could use somebody to maybe tap on the shoulder when I'm traveling out of town like he is today. And I was like, yeah, but if we start, let's start from the beginning, right? Before we work our way to the end, let's start from the very beginning. And so Numbers is the first real sort of tangible example of the phenomenon that I'm talking about, where it's not going to make sense. So I hope all of that makes sense. Yes, ma'am. Yes. So with Leviticus, so the first 7 chapters are all about. That's actually the first part. That's the 5 offerings: burnt offering, peace offering, and you don't necessarily have to remember, but there are key parts to each of the offerings that without a good understanding and a good foundation of those sacrificial offerings, it's hard to understand what the Lord Jesus did. I'll give you an example. So with the ascension offering, it's sometimes called the burnt offering. That's the only one of the 5 offerings Okay, let me back up for 1 second. There's 3 offerings. There's 4 of the 5 offerings. There's 4 that involve animals, so 4 that involve actual blood. The only one that doesn't is the grain offering. So 4 involve blood. Of those 4 with blood, 3 of them involve atonement. They're the only 3 that sort of atone for sins, because without blood, there is no atonement for sin, right? So that's your first. That's the first thing to keep in mind, is that only 3 of the 5 actually atone for sin. Of those 3, the burnt offering, sometimes called the ascension offering, is the only one where the entire animal gets burnt up. The other 2 pieces get carved up. They give it to the priest. There's even a fellowship offering where you eat some of it, like a Passover lamb, right? You take some of that home and eat it. So the ascension offering, the typology of Christ in the ascension offering, for example, is all of it gets burned up. It's a whole sacrifice. The entirety of that animal, the entire life lived by that animal, is burned up and given to God as a sacrifice, just like Jesus' entire life was given up on the cross as a sacrifice to God. Another one is a fellowship offering. You've got where everybody, the one I talked about, where you take a piece and you eat it. It was a picture of, you've got the blood of the animal, yes, providing atonement, but then you've also got everybody partakes, right? Just like Jesus reaches everybody, everybody can take. I did misstep. Fellowship offering is actually the one that doesn't provide atonement. That's the one that was meant to drive community. The other 2 that provide atonement are the sin offering and the guilt offering. We talked about that in the class. I don't know if you were here, but the sin offering, the difference, those were often given as a pair. Because if you sinned, I'll use myself as an example. If I stole $20 from you, then my sin was the fact that I stole from you, right? But that $20 was what you were going to use to put gas in your car for the week to get to work. So the guilt that is on me now for having stolen from you is the fact that I've inconvenienced you. Now you can't work. Now you're unable to earn a living. So you would offer both a sin offering and a guilt offering together, because it would make atonement with God first and foremost through the sin offering, and then it'd make atonement for our relationship because I had wronged you as well, right? So that's exactly what Jesus does, right? He forgives our sin so that we can be forgiven before the Father. So when it comes to the sacrifices, there's also another part of it when it comes to like laying on hands. And we talked about this as well. When you lay on hands, a lot of people look at that as just like you're taking the sins from your head and you're putting them on this, lamb or this whatever it is, and you're sacrificing it, you're killing it because you deserve to die for your sins. And a part of that is true. But then there's another part, and we'll see this actually in Numbers, where the people lay hands on the Levites. But they're not laying hands on the Levites to place their sins on the heads of the Levites, right? They're actually appointing the Levites as a substitute for them. And you would be doing that same thing with this lamb, with this animal. You'd be appointing it a substitute on your behalf, because that substitute is going to go where you can't go. It's going to go in God's presence, and you can't go in God's presence because you're sinful. But this perfect, spotless substitute is going to go where you can't go on your behalf. And so you're appointing it a substitute, and then you have to be the one to kill it. I don't know if you noticed that in the first 7 chapters, but you're the one who actually slaughters the animal. And I love that picture, because the question is, well, who killed Christ, right? Was it the Romans? Was it the Romans? Was it the Jews who turned him in? Was it his disciples who abandoned him? Like, who was it that actually killed Jesus? And it was everybody. We all killed him. But because we all killed him, we all have that right of passage where we're the ones who killed him, we're the ones who slaughtered him. Therefore, he is an atonement for us. Does that make sense? So there's different parts to it, and I don't want you to get confused by it. It is a lot to remember. You don't have to remember all of it, right? But there are key parts that'll help you understand when it says, Christ, like when the pieces that were left over, they take it outside the city and they burn it up to get rid of it. And in Hebrews, it talks about Christ being sacrificed outside the city, so we got to go to him. And it's kind of pointing back to the sacrifices in Leviticus. Does that make sense? That was a lot. Does that make sense? Okay. So, okay, you know what? If y'all would agree with this, that's a great question, Lynn. I thought maybe Trey'd have a quick answer. I don't have a quick answer. You saw, that was my quick answer on the sacrifices. There's not a quick answer, and it's speculative. Let me say that. It's all speculative.
To me, the Bible doesn't that.
He did. He did. He went on to be the father of Jacob and Esau, yeah.
That's right. But the Bible leaves out little details like, and you sometimes I make up, oh, maybe blah, blah, blah.
And the chosen fills them in, right? That's why we have the chosen to come in and pick up where God left off. No, and it used to drive me nuts. You're absolutely right. Like, honestly, there's debate over, was it actually even the Red Sea that was parted? The Sea of Reeds, there's reason for speculation that it was really the Red Sea. The thing is, though, and like what the actual day was, it's hard to nail down a date. If you read when they leave Egypt, it says 430 years to the day they left. And if they left on Passover, that means they got there on Passover. But did they get there? Are they starting at the day that Joseph got arrested? Or are they starting on the day that the brothers showed up? There's details that you can't nail down. And it used to drive me nuts, but here's what I've given myself over to. The details that I need to know are in there. And the ones that God left out, He left out on purpose. Because we don't need to know those things. Leave the details to God, exactly. So, and there's plenty of details in there already, like with the sacrifices, where I don't need more details. I'd love to have some better understanding of the dates. And if you're okay with giving me some time, I promise I will talk about Isaac. But there's a better place for me to do it. And again, it's not a short answer, but I'll give it to you if you're okay with it. Okay, all right. Yeah. Yes. And she said he was really mad at Abraham and he went off to pout. And we have a 12-year-old at home and he does that to me all the time. And I have never tried to offer him as a living sacrifice. So I can only imagine. I did want to say one quick thing, because we're speaking about details, and I had really wrestled with, because I'm a big picture guy now, and I had really wrestled with to even say this or not, but it's come up twice. A couple months ago, actually, Lynn shared something with me, and she goes, "This is true." And then a couple weeks ago, Tom came up and said something about it, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to talk about it, because it's just so cool. It's too cool not to talk about, but it is a detail. So if y'all can give me just 5 minutes, I want to tell y'all something, and then we'll actually get into numbers and all the little drawings. So in the Torah, if you go back to Genesis 1:1, the first phrase in the entire Bible is in the beginning, right? And the first phrase in Hebrew is the word Bereshit. And the first letter in that, that's the phrase, the first word in that phrase is the word Beit. And the first letter in that word is the letter T, the equivalent of our English letter T. And if you go, the last letter, yeah, excuse me, thank you. If you start there, if you start at that letter T, and then you go 50 more letters, there's an O. And then if you go 50 more letters, there's an R. And if you go 50 more letters, there's an A. And if you go 50 more letters, there's an H. And it spells Torah. But here's the crazy thing, y'all. That carries on throughout the entire book of Genesis, which almost seems impossible. But it carries on throughout the entire book that every 50 letters, it just spells Torah over and over and over again. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is you get to Numbers, and it spells it backwards. It starts with an H, and then 49 letters later, there's an A. And then 49 letters later, there's an R, and then an O, and then a T. And it spells Torah backwards over and over and over again throughout Numbers and Deuteronomy. So you've got Genesis and Exodus spelling Torah this way, and Numbers and Deuteronomy spelling Torah this way, and they come to meet right at Leviticus. And if you go to the seventh letter of Leviticus, it's the letter Y. And then 7 letters later, it's an H. And then 7 letters later, it's a W. And then 7 letters later, it's an H. And for those of you who are going to go home and Google this and try and prove me wrong, keep in mind in Hebrew, W and V are interchangeable. So sometimes it's YHVH and sometimes it's YHWH. But point is, it all points to Leviticus. And then in Leviticus is the name Yahweh, the name of God. And I was like, dude, that is so cool. But that's not even the coolest part. Wait, there's more. That's right. It's always more for my detailed friends out there, my detailed homies. So the beginning phrase right there, Bereshit, and then the first word Beit, it begins with their B, or the equivalent of our B, which is the second letter in the alphabet. Now, the Hebrew alphabet, or the Hebrew language really, is an alphanumeric language. That means there are no numbers. So if I were to tell y'all, hey, turn to Genesis 1:1, I would say turn to Genesis Aleph Aleph, which is the first letter in the alphabet, right? So it's the equivalent of the number 1. So the letter Beit is the second. So people debate, or rabbis really debate, why did God start the Bible with the letter Beit? It's the second letter. Why didn't he start with Aleph, which is the first letter, to show like his oneness and his supremacy and his sovereignty over creation as the one true God? And the answer, I believe, is found in the back of the book. If you go to the end of Revelation, chapter 22, the very last word in the Bible is Amen. And it ends with the Hebrew letter Nun, which is basically RN. And together, these two letters make the word Ben, which means son in Hebrew. And so the entire thing, of course, is not about the oneness of God. It's about the Son of God and his plan of redemption for us. I just think that's cool. You may not think that's cool, but it's too late now. You've already had to listen to it. So that's like, it's time to go almost. And that's the intro. Any questions so far on the intro? Now, I do think Numbers is going to be fun quick. I said fun, but I meant quick. Because John already took the best 2 parts. So we're going to skip those. We're probably just going to take a couple of Sundays and be done with it. If you've got your blue books, if you want to turn to the back, I wanted to give you a couple of just visual sort of things to maybe help make sense of the book of Numbers in a way maybe that it hasn't before. If the first one should look like this, it has a little picture or a little sign on it that says Mount Sinai. And it's so cool the way that God does it. And what I wanted to show y'all visually is where in the Torah were we camped out at Mount Sinai. So if you start at Genesis, of course we are not at Mount Sinai. Then in Exodus we're in Egypt. And then we leave Egypt, and in chapter 19 of Exodus, we get to Mount Sinai and we camp out. And they stay there all the way until Numbers 10. So the entire rest of Exodus happens while camped out on Mount Sinai. All of Leviticus happens while they're camped out on Mount Sinai. And then the first 10 chapters of Numbers happen on Mount Sinai, and then they leave in the 10th chapter, and the rest, they're sort of wandering around. So I just wanted to show you that. And the reason that that matters, the funny thing is I showed this to Jennifer, and the first thing I said, does this make sense to you? And she goes, well, is that how you spell Sinai? And I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Sinai, but nobody calls it that. So I'm going to keep calling it Sinai, but it is interesting. But the reason that matters is because in Exodus chapter 3, God calls Moses at the burning bush. And if you remember, we talked about this when we talked about the name Yahweh. Moses sort of pushes back on God. And he says, he gives him 5 sort of reasons why he can't do it. And the first reason he gives God is, who am I? And God says, you're right. You ain't nothing, but I'll be with you. In other words, my trust isn't in you, my trust is in me, and I'll be with you. And he says, this will be a sign to you. You will come back and worship God on this mountain. The mountain they were on is this mountain right here. And so Mount Sinai, it's called Mount Horeb at that point. But when you get to chapter 19 in Exodus, this is a fulfillment of prophecy, if you will, from chapter 3. And they spend about 11 months, close to a year, on top of the mountain. And but that ain't nothing compared to how long they spend in the woods afterwards. And it ain't nothing compared to how long it took for us to get through Genesis. That was like, 2,000 some odd years. So just a little visual representation of our time there on Mount Sinai. And then the next part is the one with the buckets on it. And this is sort of, to be honest, my plan has changed since I drew this, but I was too lazy to redraw it. So forgive me, we're only going to probably look at 2 buckets. Originally, I had thought 3. There really is sort of 3 main buckets of numbers. It's the first 10 chapters before they leave. And then it's the middle, which is 11 through 24, where they're sort of wandering around. And then the last 10 chapters, 25 or 11 through 25 through 36, they're waiting. I wanted to come up, this is how you know I'd be a terrible Southern Baptist preacher. I couldn't come up with 3 T words. I had 2, tense from Numbers 1 through 10, tes from Numbers 11 through 24, but I couldn't come up with one for the third, so I just wrote TBD, and I was like, that starts with a T. I'm just going to leave it. So it was originally meant to just be a holding spot, but I just left it. I did see a pastor, he used W, so he must have been a Southern Baptist, I'm not sure, but he had walking, wandering, and waiting. I like those 2. But I was really trying to come up with a third T word, and I was going to email Preacher Mike. Look what I did. I got 3 T words right here. But anyways, the one thing I did want to call out here just below is, because this too can make Numbers a little confusing, is Numbers kind of goes back and forth between some different time periods. In Numbers 1:1, it's the first day of the second month in the second year. In Numbers 9, it's the first month in the second year. And if you're reading along, you're like, wait a second, this doesn't make, we're already in February, and now it's telling me we're in January. Why is it going backwards? And the main reason that happens specifically in chapter 9, because then in chapter 10, we pick right up back in the second month, and now we're on the 20th day. And that's when we leave. But the reason it sort of looks back is because if it had given us the information it gives us in chapter 9, which we'll get there eventually, if it had given us that information in chapter 1, it would not have made sense. Sometimes when the Bible jumps back like that, it's because had it given it to you when it sort of established a time reference initially, if it had given you that information, you'd been like, well, what the heck is this talking about? So keep that in mind, that it was just sort of looking back. It's not that we're going back in time. We're just looking back to something that maybe had it been given to us on the front end wouldn't have really made sense to us. So then our third sheet, is the sheet we're going to walk through today. And it's our sheet on tense, which is our first T word. And I don't know how many of you used to watch Ninja Turtles, but this thing right here is very near and dear to me. It's called a grappling hook. I think Batman had one too, but I didn't have time for Batman with my busy Ninja Turtle schedule. And what they would do, like if they were falling down a building, because turtles can't fly, and if they were falling down a building, they'd throw a grappling hook up to the top and it'd catch them, so they didn't die. Or if they wanted to go up to the top and they were on the ground floor, they'd shoot their grappling hook and then it'd pull them up to the top, which is really cool. I think Batman did that too. But the point is, the Bible kind of starts doing that in Numbers. What we've been talking about all these sort of like looks back. Imagine God's like throwing a grappling hook all the way back to Genesis, and he's like pulling it back into your memory, and he's like, see, this is what I was talking about. So we're going to look at some of those too. I kind of made notes out here, like in Numbers 1:1, for example, when it says, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. on the first of the second month in the second year after the day they'd come out of the land of Egypt, he's looking back at Exodus 40 saying, hey, the problem that we had in Exodus 40 has now been resolved. Does that make sense? So we're throwing that grappling hook backwards and we're bringing it back in to view. So turn with me to Numbers chapter 2, if you have your Bible. Because God, any questions so far? I feel like I'm still in the intro. Any questions on the second half of the intro? Yes, sir.
I think it's important. So Numbers only focuses on the remnant from Japheth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not Shem and Ham,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think it's
Well, now Shem is it is Shem, Ham and Canaan.
Japheth and Ham are not included. So I think it's very
Or
important.
Japheth,
And
yeah,
the reason
yeah.
why he's focusing on just
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so actually that's cool. I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, we'll get to that in number 6, because Shem, there's something cool that happens with Shem that'll kind of blow your mind. And hopefully we'll get through that today. But yes, you are right. So what he's talking about is Noah had 3 boys in chapter 9 of Genesis, and one of the sons received a blessing. Japheth received a blessing just like to hang out with Shem. Which that's how you know you're blessed, if other people are blessed just to be around you. I tell Jen that's how she is. She's like Shem, because I'm blessed just to be around her. And then that just came to me too, by the way. But then Ham, his son Canaan gets cursed. Ironically, that's where we're going, the land of Canaan. But look at Numbers chapter 2. And let's look at sort of how God arranges the camp. And I drew this on your paper. I'm not going to read this word for word, but watch this. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the sons of Israel shall camp, each by his own standard, with the banners of their fathers' households. They shall camp around the tent of meeting at a distance." So what he does is he says, hey, the tabernacle is going to be in the midst of the camp. And what I want you to do is I want you to pick groups of 3, or I'm going to tell you groups of 3, and you're going to assign them like a manager. Like they're going to have what he calls a standard, and that's a banner waver, a flag waver of each of these little sort of clans that I'm going to place around the tabernacle. In fact, John Bremer made a comment when we were going through the tabernacle of how God specifically and strategically places these folks around the camp, and how sort of their paths form a cross over the entire tabernacle if you're looking at it from God's point of view. It's super cool. But God doesn't miss an opportunity to show us something here. So this is our tabernacle, right? This is the tent of meeting, and then this is the bronze altar. And what he says is, I want you to send, he sends the tribe of Dan to the north, and he makes them the banner waver. He sends Ephraim, which is one of Joseph's boys. He sends Ephraim, his brother Manasseh, and Benjamin to the left, and he makes Ephraim the banner waver. And then he sends Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, to, I spell that right? No, I did not. Well, whatever. He sends Reuben south, and it should be spelled like that, I feel like. Anyway, he sends Reuben to the south along with, I think it's Simeon. Who is it? Simeon? Gad, yes. Simeon and Gad, thank you. And then he sends Judah to the east. And he sends Judah over here with Issachar and Zebulun. Now, the interesting thing about this is these boys, they can't see the tent of meeting. In other words, they can't see God's presence in the tent of meeting or in the tabernacle. Only Judah can see God's presence in the tabernacle. We talked about this, and I want to remind you because this is unbelievable to me. In Genesis, this is our little grappling hook for Numbers 2. In Genesis 3:24, God sends Adam and Eve out of the garden, and he places a flaming sword and cherubim which turn every which way to guard the entrance to the garden. The garden is God's presence. They are guarding the entrance to God's presence. They're guarding access to God. Does that make sense? When Judah wakes up in the morning and comes out of his little tent or whatever, and he looks at the tabernacle. He sees the fire on the bronze altar, which is to be burning perpetually, right? And then he sees the veil, which is covered in cherubim. So he comes out of his tent and he looks at the tent of meeting, which is God's presence, which is where God is. And he sees, guarding the entrance of God's presence, the flame and the cherubim. Exactly what Adam and Eve looked back on at the garden. Not only that, he goes on to do something else in chapter 3 that when I saw it, I was like, you got to be kidding me. So look with me in chapter 3. Just a quick sort of catch up here. God calls the tribe of Levi to be priest. That's actually what we're going to look at today. We're going to kind of focus on Levi. I'm hoping to explain why the tribe of Levi is different, why they matter. That's what I'm hoping you walk away with today. Other than the fact that I'm just so blessed to be around Jennifer. So he calls Levi and he says, Levi had 3 boys. He had Merari, he had Gershon, and he had Kohath. And he says, they're going to help you carry this stuff because these old boys, they can't touch it. They're damaged goods, right? I don't want them in my tent. I don't want them in my tabernacle. That way, these boys are going to carry it. So what he does is he puts Merari right here on the northern side between Dan and the tabernacle. He puts Gershon right here on the western side between Ephraim and his clan and the tabernacle. And then he puts Kohath right here between Reuben and the tabernacle. And then for Judah, he puts Aaron, the high priest. Aaron and his boys. One thing I want to call out, because if you have a good memory, then you remember the names here in black are the 12 sons of Jacob. And you're like, well, who the heck is Ephraim? And where is Joseph in all of this? So I just mentioned that God calls the tribe of Levi, and he says, they are special to me. And I'll explain that in a minute. If we go back, if we throw our grappling hook back to Genesis 48, Jacob tells his son Joseph. So remember what happened to Joseph. Jacob thought he was dead. He said, I'm going to go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. That should make so much sense to y'all now that you understand resurrection. He said, I'm going to go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. And then, so imagine the resurrection that takes place when he goes to Egypt and actually so Joseph is alive. So Joseph, he gives a double portion, but what happens is Jacob adopts, basically he steals. He tells Joseph, he says, your 2 boys, they're mine, right? I thought I had lost you. I'm getting double for my trouble. Your 2 boys are mine. And he even tells, now he's not mean about it, because he tells Joseph, he says, any boys you have after this, you can have them. But these 2 boys, they're mine. So he takes Ephraim and Manasseh, and he takes them from Joseph, and they sort of supplant Joseph as part of Jacob's sons. But Levi's still in the group right now at this point. So now we've got 13 sons of Jacob, and really 13 tribes of Israel. But then when God calls Levi to himself, that fixes our problem of 12. So essentially, you've got Manasseh going in place of Joseph, and you've got Ephraim going in place of Levi, and that's how we get back to a nice round number of 12. And that's how those 2, you're going to see the half-tribe of Manasseh mentioned quite a bit throughout the rest of the Torah, and hopefully that helps it make sense when we see that name come up, because they were not mentioned in Genesis because they did not exist in Genesis. So he takes the sons of Levi, because he's called them to himself at this point, and they're priests, and he puts them between the clans and the tabernacle. And you go, well, why did he do that? Well, he's making for them, remember our discussion about the Day of Atonement and how the pollution and the sinfulness and the impurities of these boys got all over his tabernacle and just made a mess of things. Well, now we've got a buffer. Now we've got a priest that's not only, things are filtering through, right? The sins and the impurities of these boys are being filtered through a priest into or outside of the tabernacle. Not only that, the dangers that come with the presence of the living God being in your midst are then getting filtered back into these folks. Remember, we talked about the presence of God being like the sun, right? Without the sun, there's no food, there's no life, there's nothing. But you go too close to the sun, it'll kill you, right? God's presence is no different. Without Him, there is no life. But you get too close in a wrong way, just ask Aaron's sons, it will kill you. So it's not an accident, though, that God puts the high priest of Israel in between Judah and His presence. So we're already sort of getting a picture, just based on the way the camps are set up, that the high priest will come out of Judah into God's presence. Yes?
One other great overlay is the orientation northeast, southwest, with the sun coming up, as you mentioned. And throughout time, pretty much Constantine on, as they started to develop church floor plans and orientation, a lot of them faced the east, so the sun is hitting the front of that building and lighting into the temple, or lighting into the sanctuary up to the stage. And it wasn't until we got to more of the modern block system that we would think of like New York City, that they started kind of fit them in different places.
Yeah.
So that orientation of facing east
Yeah.
has been a long
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
thread over time.
Yeah. And I love that.
Coming back in the East Gate.
He's come back in the East Gate. That's right. And you know, for Adam and Eve, in fact, let me tell you all this, and John is still chewing on this, but he and I have been talking about, you know, we got these YouTube videos, and I'm like, they're working, but if you want to do a podcast, because you see everything that's happening in the world, and you're like, man, we cannot be that far away, right? And so what does it look like to like leave something for people to stumble upon perhaps when we're gone? And so we've been talking about, you know, maybe YouTube videos, maybe to like take it onto a podcast. Sean, who's in the class, I don't see him this morning, but he knows all about that stuff, and he's agreed to help us. And I was telling John, I was like, but the thing is, like, I like the name Armament, but I feel like it's confusing. And I said, I just want you to pray about possibly changing the name to Westbound. And the reason I like the name Westbound is because when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden to the east, you know, for them to get back in the presence of God, they got to go west, right? And that becomes a picture throughout the rest of the Bible, is if you want to be in the presence of God, because even though this tabernacle moved, you're right, Andy, even though this thing moved, no matter where they set it up, the gate was always on the eastern side, because to get to God, you got to be westbound. And I thought that was kind of cool. But I love that picture that develops over the course of time, and even our churches honor that as well. Yes.
I just want a quick question.
Mhm.
When, in Revelation, when it talks about the foundation of the new heaven being the 12 tribes, is it going to be Levi and Joseph, or is it going to be Ephraim and Manasseh? Because if it's not Joseph, why not? Because he was obviously, you know, a strong, chosen person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, but Joseph received the double portion from Jacob, which typically was reserved for the firstborn. Typically, the firstborn received the double portion, which this kind of feeds into where we're going. But the reason is because the firstborn represented the future. They represented what was coming next. So if you wanted to see what was in store for your family, then just look at your firstborn, because that's going to be who carries the name. And so, and firstborn son, by the way. And so you could sort of circumvent that process, and if your firstborn was just ain't hitting on nothing, you know what I mean? You could circumvent the process from time to time and give the inheritance to a son who was perhaps more deserving, which of course in this case Jacob deemed Joseph more deserving. He was his firstborn son with his real wife, or his due wife. But the reason Ephraim and Manasseh sort of replaced Joseph in this instance is because they represented what was next. Yes?
The part of it also is that Reuben lost the birthright.
Yeah.
Remember, the birthright means you inherit twice as much as all the other boys.
Mm-hmm.
So Reuben forfeits the birthright.
Yeah.
Joseph, Jacob says, because you slept with Rachel's, one of my 4 wives, Rachel's handmaid. And then he passes the birthright down to Joseph. So Joseph therefore gets 2 portions.
Yeah.
And then Jacob identifies those 2 portions in the inheritance as Ephraim and Manasseh. He also says that he's going to scatter Simeon and Levi throughout the tribes of Israel. It's also in Genesis. And that's how he accomplishes it. And so Levi gets no inheritance.
Yeah.
Because they have, they get God as the inheritance. And so Ephraim and Manasseh, being Joseph's 2 sons, they take over, like Brad mentions, the inheritance of Levi. So that's kind of balanced out. That all deals with the whole matters of birthright and inheritance.
That's right. Yeah.
The blessing, of course, ends up going to Judah.
That's right. Yeah, because just like Jacob skips Reuben, he kind of forfeited his birthright. Simeon and Levi, remember, they avenged their sister's wrong, so he couldn't give it to them because of their sin, so it filters down to Judah. But the interesting thing is, you knew it was going to Judah all along, because when Judah is the one son that when they're leaving Joseph, before they even know who Joseph is, and Joseph's like, give me Benjamin, Judah's like, take me instead. And you see Judah sort of, the posture of his heart is, take me in his place. And that's exactly the posture of the Lord Jesus' heart. So you kind of knew it was going to be him, but the first 3 boys aided that along. All right, so let's look just real quick then at what it means for him to call Levi his own. So Numbers 3:17, it says, these are the sons of Levi by their names, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. We already talked about that. Look at Numbers 3, verse 44. It says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the sons of Israel and the cattle of the Levites, and the Levites shall be mine. I am the Lord. And you go, well, why did he take the Levites? What made them special? And what does it mean for them to come in place of the firstborn anyway? And I think the answer is exactly what Cynthia kind of alluded to, is that the firstborn kind of pictures what's coming next. So if we go back to the Exodus from Egypt, God goes through the land and he wipes out every firstborn in the entire land of Egypt. We were doing a study on the Passover at my house one night, and a friend of mine asked, he was like, Brad, he said, if an Egyptian had put the blood of a spotless lamb over his door, would his son have been spared? And the answer is absolutely. Because the inverse of that is true as well. If a Jewish family had not put the blood, their son would have been killed, right? So the matter at hand is not who's in the house, it's what's over the house. And that's still the case even today. And so the point is, the firstborn, God could have wiped out the firstborn of every single family in that land in that first night, although he provided for them a substitute. He gave them the substitute through that perfect lamb. So even though their lives had been spared, the firstborn of all of Israel kind of belonged to him. Not kind of, they belonged to him, right? Because he spared their life because of the substitute that he provided. Man, I wish I had time to go into the Egyptian family thing, but I don't. Yes?
What is firstborn son?
Firstborn son, yes, correct. You know what, maybe... Anyway, we may have to pick this up. We may have to finish this next week anyway. So let me tell y'all something. And I just think this is so awesome, where God sort of, he says, these old boys are mine. to my friend's question, I didn't have to guess what the answer to his question is because the Bible makes it very clear. If you remember back in the 10 plagues of Egypt, the seventh plague is hail. And when the hail comes down, when the warning is still going out, it says, the Egyptians who feared the word of Yahweh took their livestock into the house. But the ones who paid no regard to the word of Yahweh left them in the field. Now, there's a problem with that because in the fifth plague, God had wiped all their livestock out. If you remember, He hit them with the plague and He wiped all of their livestock out. But there's something incredible that happened if you go back and look again at the fifth plague where He lists everything out that He killed. He killed all their cows. He killed all of their lambs. He killed all of their beasts of the field, if you will. But the one that He does not mention are goats. It doesn't say anything about Him killing their goats. I believe, and we could debate this if you wanted, but I believe He purposefully left them goats because He knew, just like in Israel, there were folks who feared Him and folks who didn't. In Egypt, there were folks who feared Him and folks who didn't. Imagine being Egyptian, hearing all the things God's going to do for the first 6 plagues, and He does every single one of them. At some point, you figure you'd catch on, right? And so by the 7th one, He's like, hey, hail's going to come down. It's going to wipe everything out. You'd be like, let's get them inside, right? And so I believe that He left them goats, and then they came to a decision point in the 7th plague where you either had to take your goats in the house or leave them in the field. And if you left them in the field, guess what? They were all going to die because they were all going to get pounded by the hail. And you would have no goats left. You'd have nothing to sacrifice come the night of the Passover. So your opportunity then to fear the word of the Lord actually came at the 7th plague. It had nothing to do really, well, it did, but it had less to do with the 10th plague where you had to sacrifice that 1-year-old goat and put the blood over your door, and more to do with, did you believe Him back at the 7th plague? And did you take your livestock inside, and do you still have it with you to now put it over the door in the 10th and final plague at the night of Passover? We'll pick it up there and talk more about the firstborn. I do want to leave you with one little thing that if you feel so led to talk about numbers, or if you're just feeling like Debbie Down about numbers, I get it. But if you want to look at why God chose the tribe of Levi, we're not exactly sure. God could have chose whoever He wanted, but the Bible does give us some clues. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to maybe go back and look at Exodus 32 through 34 and see if you can find any clues as to why God may have chosen the Levites. He could have chose whoever He wanted. But we'll talk more about that next time. And are there any questions so far? I feel like we did not get very far. I apologize. The intro took way longer than I thought it would. Any questions? Yes, Gabe, go ahead.